So, how to sharpen a chainsaw. That's a widely debated topic. I'm not saying my method's right, but it works really well for me over the years. So I'll show you some of the tools that I use to sharpen up my saw. Round chainsaw file, depth gauge, and a flat file. I'm happy to use a little triangle file because I like the narrow width on it. So let's get started and I'll show you my method for sharpening a chainsaw. So I just cut about a cord of wood this morning and I want to touch this Husqvarna 372 XPW up just a little bit before we go out and cut up the next cord of wood. If you don't have a vise at home, that's not a big deal. I just happen to have the convenience of having one here at the house, so I take advantage of it. But it can be done on the back of a truck, a block of wood, anything you want to try using. So if you do lock it down in a vise, make sure that your chain is not pinched in the jaws so it can free flow. You also want to make sure your chain's relatively tight, because when we start filing, if that rocks one way or another really hard, we will not get a good consistent sharpen. So there's a little line on the top side of the tooth. We're going to try to keep our file relatively as close to the same degree as that line as we can. So my first stroke is going to be in a downward angle. Okay. That's going to help get the material out of the bottom of that gullet down there. And then I start flattening it out every stroke, watching the top of that tooth. When that's good and sharp, the cutting point of that tooth will be nice and sharp. There'll be no little white lines there. It'll be all chrome. Okay, on to the next tooth. When you get to the end of that filing, it's going to have a completely different feel. One thing I like to do is take my little lumber crayon and I mark that tooth. It's not a necessity because it will show up really good, but it just lets me know ahead of time when I'm coming to the last tooth. Sometimes I get a little impatient. So this file will only cut in one direction. If you drag it backwards, it'll round the edges of them little teeth off that do the filing for you. And I don't go by the myth that there's a set number of strokes that you have to take. These teeth, it's been proven time and time again that they do not all have to be exactly the same width. And when we get into the depth gauges, I'll show you why they don't have to be the same length. So if you're measuring them with a set of dowel calipers, you are absolutely wasting your time. So what I'm doing right there is I'm just tapping the shavings out of the little grooves on that file. That'll help it keep it clean. Okay, we're all the way back to the beginning. I didn't even have to spend a bunch of time looking to see if I had a shiny tooth or not. That's why I like that little bit of blue chalk in there. So now we'll switch to the other side. You can either go if you please, or you can come around to the left side of the saw. Either way, whatever works for you. So what I'm watching for right now is I want the top of that cutter tooth right there to be a nice straight line. If the angle of your file is varying side to side, that tooth will have quite a little wave to it. So I'm watching the top to make sure it's nice and straight. When you have a dull tooth, you'll have just a faint little white line on the top, and that's the carbon steel of the tooth down underneath. These are all chrome plated, so what we're doing is actually filing the steel back, so we're into all good chrome. You see that little round file makes a nice little half moon down in there. I don't know if you can see it from the camera angle there or not, but we'll zoom in a minute when we're done. The way this works is the little lead edge right there, that little sharp edge, is the first piece that contacts the wood. And these little things in the front are called depth gauges, and we'll get these adjusted to the proper height for these. So what that does is that allows that little tiny corner of that tooth to grab a piece of wood, and then it rolls that chip down inside this round cavity, and it will store it there until your chain comes on the outside of the wood, and then it will spit that chip out. And then it keeps going really fast. We'll sharpen a little bit here left-handed just so you can see the idea for that. So what I'm doing here is pushing with this hand, and I'm just simply guiding with these other two fingers. But as you'll watch when I get started, these first few initial downstrokes are really important, because if you don't get the material down out of the bottom of this file will just keep riding up every time you go to sharpen. So to keep the proper file depth in the tooth, you really want to make sure you get the bottom of that gullet out down in there. Say that tooth there found a rock. The wood we were cutting this morning was kind of muddy. Last tooth. Now we'll switch over and we'll use our little gauge and our flat file. What we're going to do here is get the relationship between this depth gauge right here to the right depth below the edge of this cutter tooth. And this handy little gauge made by Husqvarna I find works really good. I've tried a bunch of different ones, but they're relatively cheap. They last a while. So there's a hardwood and a softwood setting. Today I'm cutting tree length firewood up into firewood. And when I'm on the pile in hardwood, I run the soft side. When I'm out falling trees and working out in the woods, doing a lot of boar cutting and stuff, I'll always use that hardwood side because it gets too aggressive when you're boar cutting and things of that nature. But when you're in a pile, the end of this bar is not buried in a piece of wood. The soft setting will save you a bunch of time. So if we put this on the top of this tooth and down into the notch of the next tooth, try to do it slow here and it don't work out for me. So there's our flat file. If you keep up on these often, you won't have a lot of material to take off. But as you can see, that puts a slight taper on that depth gauge. And that's because when it comes around the end of the bar, it's going to match that radius really well and do its job effectively and not be bouncing that tip every time. I got ahead of myself, we forgot a tooth. And you can do each side all from the same side. And if it's squeaking really loud, just change the angle of that file and come into the tooth opposed to going straight across. Straight across will create a lot of vibration in that. It's just a very little bit you're taking off. It's super important to keep the proportion just right. If you stay diligent in this, you're going to save a lot of hours on this saw's life over the course of time. If you're just kind of haphazardly knocking these off a little bit now and then, that changed the amount of how much that cutter's taking off on every pass. So some teeth will be taking a fair amount and others will be hardly cutting. So it's really important to save the life of that crankshaft. If these teeth aren't all taking the same all the time, it's going bang, 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 bang. And that's all transferring into the motor of that saw. So, as I was telling you earlier, the amount of strokes that you take in the tooth with the round file really doesn't matter. Some teeth can be absolutely short, some can be absolutely long. You want to take off the metal that you need to take off to get that tooth sharp. And the reason I say that the length of this doesn't matter, and if you can see, these cutter teeth are actually set at an angle like that. So the more you file off and come back, the lower that tooth gets. So if we keep these depth gauges in proper proportion, the tooth will always be taking the same amount of steel. So that throws out the old myth of you can only take 3 strokes on every tooth. I've done this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and it's just not the case. If you got a tooth that hit a rock and it needs a lot of filing, file it down. Get that tooth sharp. Let it do its job. And if this was a little maintenance type touch-up filing, I would only address these rakers, depth gauges, every other time I sharpen, providing I didn't have to take much off the tooth when I sharpen. This morning we were into some pretty muddy materials, so as you can see, the amount of strokes I took on each tooth was relatively substantial. Okay, back to the original tooth. Now we've made it all the way around. Everything's sharp. All the depth gauges are set. Now it needs fuel and oil. And I'll get a good little close-up of what an actual tooth looks like. See how we got a nice little hook in the tooth there? You can see it even better on this one. It's a nice little hook right in that tooth. That's what's going to do all the cutting. It's going to start your cut right there, and that chip's going to roll right down inside of there and hang out until the chain makes a full revolution and then spit it out. And you can see really good in this close-up shot how these teeth are angled backwards. So as you sharpen and you get further back and further back and further back, the height of that tooth is actually decreasing by a fair amount. So that's why it's super important to keep these depth gauges at the proper proportion to that tooth. So the last thing we want to do before we go out and start cutting is fuel up the saw. On this particular Husqvarna, and every saw to my knowledge, gas is on the back, bar oil is on the front. This is a mixed high octane gas. I run ethanol free. These little motors really do not like the ethanol. So this is a mixed. You have to check on every different saw. They all have a different specification on what they want. For an oil mixture, I run 50-to-1 on this particular saw. I buy the Husqvarna oil that's made for this particular XP style saw. It really likes it. I've had no issues with the motor since I've run it. I've tried junk oil in the past, and I've seized quite a few pistons. So this is the bar oil, and I know a lot of you are going to scream at me when I pour this in, but this is used motor oil. I have plenty of used motor oil around here, whether it's coming from my chipper or my skidder or tractor or truck or whatever it might be. What I do is I take these paint filters that an auto body shop would use to strain paint before they paint your car. I stick this down in a funnel. I put the funnel in the bucket, and then I fill my mobile jugs up. And that seems to get out all or any little metal filings that could possibly be in the oil. So I know there'll be some arguments out there that motor oil's not quite tacky enough. When it pumps it out, it won't follow that groove all the way around, but for the amount that I cut, I find the cost savings to be quite substantial. Bars wear out in time. If I lose a little bar life because I didn't have tacky enough oil, so be it. I mean, bars get ruined, bars can be fixed, bars can be reworked, but I find that the used motor oil is more cost effective than buying gallons of actually bar and chain oil. If you're only doing a few cord at home for your personal use, feel free to buy some actual bar and chain oil. It's well worth it. I just run this thing so much that I find used motor oil works just as good for me.